A preference utilitarian identifies utility with the satisfaction of an individual's preferences. Perhaps we don't count all preferences. There are various ways of refining this idea to get the preferences that seem more important. Putting that issue aside, do non-human animals have preferences? Absolutely. Your dog makes it pretty clear when he wants to be fed or wants to go for a walk. He is expressing preferences. Again, we can worry about how exactly preference is defined and whether some organisms lack the cognitive sophistication to have preferences. This is made even harder in the case of talking about preferences rather than pleasures, because in biology we often use metaphors that involve ascribing desires and goals to things where I don't think that's really true. We might say that the gene wants to reproduce, or the species doesn't want to die out. Can we even say that that the tree wants to grow towards the sun? I'm going to put those issues aside, though, for some more committed utilitarian to work out. The more interesting issue is, does it frustrate an organism's preferences if that organism dies? Suppose somebody is desperately thirsty. She has a very strong preference to drink some water. Before she gets the water, however, she happens to have a terrible accident, fall off a cliff, and die. Would we say that her preference to get water is now frustrated? That seems strange, because with her death, the preference seems to have disappeared as well. That said, there are other preferences that seem to be more enduring. Suppose our thirsty cliff-top walker has been studying to obtain a PhD for the last 18 months. Imagine at her funeral how people will feel that her death was all the more tragic for having come before she managed to finish her PhD. It seems that this preference really has been frustrated by her death, and that the frustration is a bad thing. Her death would have been less bad if she had managed to finish the PhD first, before she died. So I suggest a preference utilitarian needs to distinguish between at least two different sorts of preferences. I'm not sure exactly how best to draw the distinction. It might be a distinction between enduring versus transient preferences. Preferences to have a drink are transient, they come and go. Or perhaps we can distinguish between intrinsic preferences versus instrumental preferences. For instance, the desire for water is not really an end in itself. Our walker merely wanted water to remove herself from the sensation of thirst, and or to stay alive, so she could finish her PhD, for instance. So we could call that an instrumental preference for water. Whereas she might not have had some further purpose for which she desires the PhD, it might be an intrinsic preference. She just wants the PhD for its own sake. So, whether we call them intrinsic preferences or enduring preferences, these are the sorts of things that might be frustrated when a person's life ends. So the end of someone's life can have a negative impact on their utility. If those preferences that are frustrated by their death would, to a greater degree, have been satisfied if they'd lived, then dying sooner lowers their utility. Just as we saw in the case of hedonistic utilitarianism, however, we need to note that whether or not it is good for someone to continue living is going to turn on whether or not their future contains a net positive amount of utility. If someone has intrinsic, enduring desires that are very likely to be frustrated for all their remaining days, then they may prefer to be dead than to live. Okay, so here's where we've got to. 1. Utilitarians can explain why it's bad to lose one's life sooner rather than later. 2. Utilitarians, however, can also explain why it's bad for an individual to keep on living. This perhaps clashes with some worldviews whereby life is a gift that must always be cherished, no matter how miserable. But I think for many people this feature of the view should be regarded as a strength. Whether or not dying is bad should depend on how good one's life would be. And third, both preference utilitarians and hedonistic utilitarians can explain why dying has an impact on the utility of humans, as well as on non-human animals.